In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation media viewers, Sublation magazine readers, Sublators. I'm Douglas Lain. I'm the author of several books, including Billy Moon, Wave of Mutilation, and of course, Bash Revolution, which I mention every week. I'm the head of Sublation Media, and with me today is my regular co-host, Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Benjamin Studebaker. I have a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. I'm the author of 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
Great. So this week we are going to do what we promised for a moment to do last week because I got the schedule twisted. We're going to be discussing Ezra Klein's newest proposal to save America and bring it into utopia. It's called Abundance. He's been making the rounds. He has a new book out. I'm not sure who published it, but it's a policy proposal, set of policy proposals to restore the dynamism of the American Republic through rezoning and a few technocratic tweaks. So I'm wondering, just to start with, Ben, what do you make of Ezra Klein's attempted resurrection and resuscitation of the Technocratic Democratic Party?
Yeah, there's a lot of YIMBY, yes in my backyard stuff, and also a lot of stuff that you might recognize from the old NumTot days. If you remember the Facebook group that many millennial leftists were in, new urbanist memes for transit-oriented teens. Very much has that kind of flavor as well. You recognize in it, there is a focus on allowing more people to move to the cities that were most successful during the Obama years. So places like San Francisco and New York. So allow more housing to be built in these cities by changing the zoning rules to make it easier to build. And one of the questions that always comes up for me in relation to all of this is, why do we have to take it as a premise that those cities have to be the engine of growth? And what about infrastructure? Now, of course, you can also try to make it easier to build infrastructure. But generally, this is difficult because infrastructure is not a great project for private companies. They don't tend to make good money on it. Even with substantial subsidies, they don't have much good reason to build a lot of infrastructure. And then the state struggles to come up with sufficient fiscal resources to fund infrastructure ventures, especially at the kind of scale that and expense that they tend to be at, with all of the rules that we have in terms of safety, all of the rules that we have in terms of consultation for infrastructure. So then you have to propose to change a lot of those rules too. And I think also there is a kind of complaint here about just the speed of the state. The state is too slow. That's a big part of this complaint. The state doesn't make decisions fast enough. Its processes are too long. And the reason the state's processes are so long is that the state wants to consult with all of these local communities and particular interest groups. And it wants to do this because it wants to bring everybody together and make sure everybody is on board before it commits to something. And this way of thinking is too slow for the kind of growth these kinds of guys want to see. They want a state that can move fast and break things. They want a state that can just act and then deal with the consequences later on. And this is in part, I think, an admiration of China on their part. A lot of, not just this book, but a lot of the books in this phylum position China and the speed with which China can build, or the speed with which the Chinese state can take decisions, as a kind of, if we don't find a way to speed up, we are going to get passed in some sense by this other way of making and taking decisions.
Right. It seemed to me that, Ezra Klein is a millennial, right? And it seemed to me that this was an attempted reboot of millennial socialism in a way. And you mentioned the I forget the name of it exactly, but the the urban transportation utopian memes. My son, who's a cusper, was very much into like watching videos about electric trains in big cities and big advocate for bike lanes, and became obsessed with the word strode, which is a combination of a street and a road. So you can't, it's like the worst of both worlds. These big wide stroads where you can't really walk alongside them, but if you go too fast, you're gonna maybe hit someone. They kind of destroy the ambiance of downtown areas or urban life. So it seemed like it took up the complaints of millennials in a variety of ways. One of them would be the complaint from millennials that it's too hard to start a family. You can't. No one can afford a house. You don't have urban areas that are really conducive to building a family, building a life, finding good gainful employment, and making your way. And so the Ezra Klein is just saying, well, all we need is some rezoning and some deregulation to speed up the construction of housing, including low-income housing in urban areas. This is the YIMBY, yes in my backyard approach, and with the aim being to drive down housing prices generally. And I guess that would also drive down rents.
This is the other thing that they don't really think about. The whole U.S. pension system relies on housing maintaining at least its present value, if not going up, because we don't have defined benefit pension plans anymore. And our Social Security program covers too small a percentage of the cost of retirement for a middle-class person. An enormous number of people rely on relatively high housing prices as the nest egg, as the basis for their retirement. So it causes a lot of social problems to actually drive down housing costs.
Yeah, there's a lot of unintended consequences possibly involved here. I recall the last time that the value of houses declined, and that was around 2008, which set off a massive global economic crisis.
They're not really looking to push down housing values. They'll say that, but that isn't really what they would do. What they would do is they would build a bunch of towers, huge towers in places like San Francisco, New York. People would rent. They wouldn't buy housing. They would rent in these towers. And then what they would try to do is they would try to make them 15-minute cities. So they would try to get the relevant amenities to be immediately around the towers. So then you can work from home, or you can work in the nearby immediate area to minimize the amount of transit that they actually have to build. And then in extremis, they would try to build transit, but they would struggle to build the transit because of all of the rules that they have for building transit. And this is something, if you look at the YouTube videos that these guys, not Ezra Klein, but the Numtat YIMBY urbanists put out, they love to do these little histories of why they never built this train line between this place and that place, or why they never built this metro line here and there. There's one I saw recently about Chicago, where they complain about how there's the way that the Chicago system works. All of the lines come into the downtown, and there's no other connections. You have to go into downtown and then out on one of the other spokes. And why is it that they never built another line? And they go into the details of how all of these people obstructed in various ways any effort to build this line. And they made arguments about highways instead. Oh, the horror of the Eisenhower system, which for them is always the boogeyman thing that threatens or menaces the things that they would like to build instead. The problems with transit are really, really serious. And their way of trying to deal with the transit problem, ultimately, I think, is to avoid having to pay too much for transportation and to just make really, really big towers that have everything that you need in or around them.
There was a novel by J.G. Ballard about one of these giant towers that had everything you needed inside of it. And it was the description of what happened when the system started to fail, including the psychological state of the tenants of the tower. I wish I could remember the name of that novel, but that's the first thing I think of is a complete dystopian kind of Mad Max feeling of being trapped inside one of these buildings and trying to figure out which floor was on your side of the Civil War taking place inside this thing, and which floor was like safe, and which floor was a combat zone. That's called High Rise. Yeah, I remember that now, and it's worth reading. By J.G. Ballard. Taking a step back from the details, but we can dive back into the details. It does seem to me that this is Klein's attempt to, he's at least pitching it as an attempt to meet and overcome Trump's populism. Rather than making America great again, we're going to make America abundant again. And there is at least a claim being made here that we can be more productive and more competitive if some of these tweaks are made to allow these towers to be built, and for including low-income housing. But it seems to me like he's really overselling it, because there's no actual aim to, unless I'm missing it. You tell me if I'm missing this, but it doesn't seem like there's any aim to onshore manufacturing or to really revitalize the industrial base of the United States involved in any of this. It's all about.
They're for Bidenomics. They're pro Bidenomics, but their objection is that Bidenomics has been unable to succeed because of regulatory hurdles that slow down the pace at which the investments can be made, such that by the time any of the investments actually come into fruition, if they actually do come into fruition, the conditions have changed such that those investments are no longer relevant. So it's really a speed complaint. They want the state to take a stronger role. They want the state to make investments and to support the growth of domestic sectors. But their complaint is that there's too many regulatory hurdles that slow down the pace at which those state investments can actually build stuff.
In a sense, this is the opposite of Trump's approach. Trump is trying to get the free market to do all of the infrastructure building and implement all the changes that he wants to be made by manipulating, through tariffs, basically, by manipulating prices and incentivizing private investment. This is
and also states, also trying to get European states and Arab states to buy weapons to support the growth of the defense sector, and therefore to support the growth of all of the other industries that are relevant for the defense sector. So there's also an attempt to goose demand on the part of the allied states by creating, also by menacing the Iranians to try to generate a perceived security risk in the Middle East to get the Arab states to buy more weapons.
Well, that seems, I mean, okay, I'll grant you that you can make that conspiratorial claim, but certainly it is.
Well, they got to bring them together. They have to get the Arab states to try to provide for security in Gaza. So they have to big up the Iranians. It's not a conspiratorial claim. It has been their strategy, both in this administration and in the last administration, to big up a threat from the Iranians for the purposes of getting the Arab states together into an alliance with Israel, or at least into soft cooperation with Israel that might fall short of a formal alliance. And now people who are wild and crazy will say that they actually intend to fight the Iranians. I don't think they actually intend to fight the Iranians, but they do cultivate a more insecure environment. They use language and they make gestures at the Iranians to try to remind the Arab states that they have a kind of common enemy or common threat in Iran that causes them to need to come together. It's weird because on Ukraine, the Biden administration's position is that Russia should be used to get the Europeans to come together and to spend more on defense. Whereas in the case of the Middle East, the Democrats are reluctant to use Iran for that purpose. And the Republicans are reversed. The Republicans are happy to use Iran to bring the Middle Eastern states together and get them to spend more and contribute more. but they're reluctant to have the Russians play that role in Europe.
Well, it seems to me that in reality, Trump has sped up the process of, at least seemingly sped up the process of European armament, in precisely in response to the perceived Russian threat, by backing off of support for Ukraine, by chumming up even with Russia or Putin, seemingly.
And this is the sense in which the two foreign policies work together. Because if you make a mess in Ukraine that generates a perceived threat, and then you go, oh, I've made a mess, and now I'm going to leave you with the mess if you don't step up and you take on a larger role. Both of the two foreign policies work in tandem. First, Biden primed the Europeans to view the Russians as this kind of threat, whereas before the Europeans were kind of friendly with the Russians, and some European leaders in particular had good personal dynamics and relationships with Putin. People like Schroeder or Berlusconi, some of these older leaders had good relationships with Putin and cooperated with him on a lot of different things. So first, you have to break that cooperation and create a sense of menace and threat, and then you have to threaten in a seemingly credible way to not support the Europeans in dealing with the problem that you created. So Biden created a problem in the European imaginary, and now Trump is using the problem that Biden created to get the Europeans to spend more on defense. So it works well in tandem. There's a kind of good cop, bad cop routine that they do. And in the two regions, the roles are reversed.
Right. So, yeah, I can see that, but it does seem to me that it could be that Trump is going to have more success unifying Europe and getting Europe to rearm than Biden did,
but only because Biden caused this conflict to happen by refusing to negotiate with Putin, and Biden didn't punish the Ukrainians for destroying the pipeline. According to the official narrative, the Ukrainians on their own decided to destroy that Nord Stream pipeline. If that's true, then the United States decided not to punish Ukraine in any obvious way for their having done this. So these are decisions that Biden took, not to negotiate with the Russians, and then to permit that pipeline to be destroyed without taking any kind of measures to signal in any significant way that this was something that the United States disapproved of. Created an energy security crisis, created a mess, and then it's only in that environment that Trump can then threaten to not continue to participate in the conflict.
Well, Spencer Leonard says that going back to Ezra Klein, that we could imagine the Democrats winning in the midterm and passing an agenda with Trump, like the one I think he's suggesting that Ezra Klein is putting forward. What do you think? How much traction is Klein's set of policies really going to get here? Is he in a position to make tangible and practical suggestions to the Democrats, or is this more along the lines of like the Green New Deal, which is basically a policy that you float in order to shore up support from the progressive base of the Democratic Party, and without ever intending to really implement most of the policies?
Well, a float can go in both of those directions ultimately, depending on how it's received. Part of what is dynamic about a float is that if it's taken up, then it might become something quite serious. But if it's not taken up, then it might have other smaller kinds of effects. So when you do something like this, of course, I'm sure they would be very happy if the Democratic Party took it up and the left was persuaded by the argument and there was a coming together around a policy. But that doesn't seem to happen very much anymore in American politics. I've noticed that the left's response is to say, even a kind of left YIMBYism would involve public housing. So it would involve the state building housing itself. And that's something that doesn't really come into this book. There are moments where they kind of soft gesture in a general vague direction at an openness to certain kinds of things. But ultimately, I don't think that these guys are really interested in doing the kinds of stuff that the Bernie-crats want to do in housing in terms of large-scale state public sector housing projects. There's no money for it anyway. they don't have any concept of where they would get the money for it or how they would be able to legitimate the deployment of state resources for that purpose. So, and they're really focused quite myopically on a handful of major American cities.
Right. Well, the other thing is that this idea of abundance, which makes a gesture towards NIMBYism and public housing, is, I think, also meant to combat the conservative complaint about major cities being in decline. And over the last 4 years, it certainly has been the case that the public perception has been that homelessness and criminality and drug abuse in the streets has increased, and that the cities are chaotic. It is Klein's suggestion aimed at actually addressing that problem. And then to add on to that, and these are almost rhetorical questions, but not quite. Is it the case that even true YIMBYism, where you build a lot of public housing that would be able to secure, homes for people who are now in the streets, would that even truly address the problems that the cities are facing with homelessness, drug abuse, and mental illness, all kind of combining to create places that, permanent encampments like Skid Row of like little communities of homelessness?
Yeah, you would have to put people in housing even though they don't have jobs or they don't have the resources to pay. You would have to do various forms of welfareism in the course of doing that to actually get off the street in any kind of significant way. And this is not even really in the horizons of what they're talking about. They're also, they'll gesture at the idea that they're going to reduce housing costs, but they're not going to do that if you're talking about buying a home. What they're going to do is they're going to create rental opportunities for people who make money, who are workers, so who are not homeless, but are currently not able to live close enough to the places where they work. So like if you go into a coffee shop, or you go into one of these craft breweries, the people who work in these places, they have to be able to live close enough to be able to get to work. And if you're not going to build transit, then you have to build some kind of tower that's nearby where you can shove these people in a tower in high density so that they can come and work in the cafe and work in the service workers. They need somewhere to be that's still close enough to where they work. And this is the tricky thing, because in a lot of towns, there are, like where I live in Indiana, there's this intense fight to avoid having to house the service workers, because if you have to house them, then their kids will go to school. And because the service workers work too many hours, they're not able to be very active parents. So their families are considered dysfunctional. So you don't want them located in your town, because if that happens, then you're going to have a bunch of them in your public schools, and then your public school system will become uncompetitive. And so then when the Illinois expats who are fleeing Illinois for tax reasons come to the region, they won't pick your town. They'll pick the town that has the best public schools. So these localities work very hard to prevent land from being zoned for the purposes of low-income housing. They want to kick those people into other towns. And this is, a dynamic that comes out of the competition among towns to attract high revenue people. And it's something that you don't really have to deal with if you're thinking just about San Francisco or New York. If you're thinking about that, then of course you can have some number of big towers for very poor people located in those cities, and then those people can fan out and do your service work. And as long as you automate enough of that stuff so that you don't have too many of those people working in the town, then you can have your anti-homeless measures to try to push your homeless people out. It's really, there's a group of people that they need in San Francisco or New York that they haven't yet figured out how to do without. And they have to find a way to get those people located in these cities where they can do these jobs. They don't want the homeless in these cities. They're not trying to build housing for the homeless, and they don't want to undercut the price of actually buying a home, because that would hurt the retirees. It's a very specific band of people that they need to find a way to house in these cities. And that's what the quest really is. How do you get the person who makes 30, 40 grand working at Starbucks? How do you get them located close enough to the Starbucks that it actually makes sense for them to do that job?
Right. Yeah. I bring this up from time to time. I have a friend who's a social worker, works on Skid Row, and I actually have been to Skid Row because of my acquaintance. And she was on the channel for a while. They had a video series, podcast series called Social Justice Incorporated, that was being run, and the premise of that podcast was that the progressives are merely trying to manage a permanent problem, disorder that they weren't ever going to be even aiming at addressing, but rather simply trying to kind of continue to juggle so that the difficulty could be livable. We could all survive it. And it seems to me that this is in line with that approach, that the aim is always going to be, whatever solution you have is always going to be particular. It's always going to be for one set of people, one kind of circumstance, and not another. So the description that you gave of the towns fighting and competing with each other in order to attract high income people, and therefore I guess also have students who excel and then attract federal dollars into the school system, or just the kinds of parents who can be taxed at a rate to support the school system. That will always mean creating some other town that's truly dysfunctional. And so all we're doing is moving the disorder around, either in a macro level from like the coast to the center, or the center back out to the coast, or within a state, or even a city, from the suburbs to the urban center, or back again. And none of these approaches are in any way universal or attempting to really get at the problem.
It doesn't need to be. If you keep people sufficiently isolated from each other so that they don't confront the experiences that other people are having, then those experiences and problems become much less politically meaningful. If you don't deploy U.S. troops to Ukraine or deploy U.S. troops to the Middle East, the things that go on there and the things that we do out there become much less meaningful to people and much less important politically. The cities are traditionally the place where everybody bumps into each other and rubs together and intermingles. And so all the problems that different people are having become visible to you, and you're forced in some way to deal with them. They affect your life. They affect you as you move around and try to do things. But if you can build cities in such a way that people don't confront the social problems that exist, then the cities can become a way of protecting people from confronting these problems instead of a way of forcing that confrontation. And so instead of being a place where people go, hey, we have to do things, cities can instead become a much more conservative force over time.
Mm-hmm. I traveled to see my parents this week, and I'm just back. And whenever I travel, I end up buying magazines at the airport. And I bought this. It's Harper's. It's worth reading. It's the cover story about Trump's feudal war against the deep state was attractive to me. But as I flipped through the magazine on the plane, the other thing that I remembered, because I used to read Harper's rather frequently, I don't anymore, was the Harper's Index. Do you remember the Harper's Index?
Ooh, remind me of
okay
that.
So I'll read you a little bit of the Harper's Index, and they're sort of just like factoids that have a rhetorical or political point. So Harper's Index this time, it says the percentage of children in Gaza who said last year that they wanted to die is 49%. Of those who believe they would die soon, 96%. Percentage of Ukrainians who said in 2022 that their country should keep fighting until it defeats Russia, 73%. The percentage who now favor negotiations to end the war as soon as possible, 52%. So these are the kinds of factoids that you get, and they make a rhetorical point as you go through them. Let's see. I'll give you a couple of other examples. Percentage increase in book sales in the United States over the past year, 1%. In Bible sales, 22%. So I feel like the Harper's Index is a great example of how the left or the progressive left understands and argues for policies, and this sort of like, but by presenting facts that push you in a particular direction, like for instance, in let's see, with the number of book sales only increasing by 1%, but the Bible sales is 22%. It shows that maybe the problem is some sort of Christian culture of illiteracy. Perhaps that's what's being argued by taking those particular statistics out. And to make my point a little bit more pointedly about Harper's, when I read the actual cover story about Trump's feudal war against the deep state, it concluded by saying that Elon Musk and Trump and the Trump administration in general is failing to realize and address the true difficulty in the federal government, which is not that the administrative state has expanded, but rather that the governmental services that used to be done by the state have been privatized, so that we now have these private actors who are setting rules and regulations and nearly passing laws through NGOs and nonprofits and outside contractors of all sorts. When it comes to military policy, it's these quasi-military organizations and arms manufacturers, maybe. And when it comes to city planning, it's these NGOs and nonprofits that are truly taking up the task of the administrative state, and which can't be addressed only by rearranging the deck chairs within the bureaucracy. But so it seemed to me that what Harper's did was retreat into a critique of neoliberalism, which in some ways was useful, because it was useful to be reminded that during the Clinton years, Al Gore ran basically the equivalent of DOGE and ended up dismissing around 500,000 public employees. That's worth remembering. But then the argument is, through this effort, what's going to be generated is private sector replacements, probably lower paying, for the very administrative state that we're supposed to be creating efficiency in by making these cuts. And it doesn't necessarily lead to anything more efficient to create all these private entities to do the same job. In fact, these private entities just expand themselves. So I just found like the difficulty with Harper's was that, okay, you get to that critique of neoliberalism, but without any direction except, I guess, back into let's increase state spending. Let's embrace some sort of Green New Deal or some sort of big infrastructure project, or it's basically the last gasp of the Bernie movement here in Harper's, it felt like to me. And it was, of course, written by Andrew Coburn, whose brother is Alexander Coburn, and some counterpunch and long-standing leftist intellectuals in America. So anyway, that's just really an observation, but it does seem to me that like Harper's represents a certain kind of worldview that isn't fully articulated, but presented through like the Harper's Index or these think pieces that don't quite land on their political point.
Yeah, I think that they're a little bit behind here because the Quangoification has occurred. At this point, a lot of the government spending that occurs is spent out to these private organizations that have a kind of Quango equality because so much of their customer base is the state or its states. That's already really happened. So a lot of the cuts that are being proposed, the emphasis is always on the federal workforce. But I think a lot of it ultimately will not be to do with the federal workforce. It will be money paid out to various kinds of Quango organizations. What does U.S. aid do? Yes, it has employees, but also it pays money out to various quasi-independent, quasi-private organizations in an attempt to affect the culture by shaping or molding in some way the civil society of foreign states. So I think that in a lot of cases, we will be talking about the money that the federal government pays out to these organizations. Really, the function of the whole thing, I still think the function of the whole thing is to try to legitimate the tax cut that they're going to try to extend and perhaps intensify as they debate the budget over the course of this year. They're trying to create a friendlier kind of public environment. And this is why so much of it is just about news cycle, news story, narrative about the government. Is the government wasteful? Is the government something that is poorly run, poorly managed? And the purpose of creating that discussion is to try to do a tax cut. And really, the thing that we would have been debating if they were not doing all of this DOGE stuff is that tax cut. We would be arguing, should we do that tax cut? What form should the tax cut take? Who potentially is benefiting or not benefiting from the tax cut? We'd be having a discussion more similar to the one we had in 2017. But because Elon Musk has a bunch of Zoomers running around looking for arguments, effectively looking for arguments for doing a tax cut, we're focused on that activity and really missing, I think, what will ultimately be the significant thing, which is that at some point over the course of this year, there's going to be an extension of or expansion of those Trump tax cuts.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with the political aim of DOGE, but if we did take it at face value, or at least say that it had some other purpose than that, the question does arise to, how monstrous is DOGE? Right now on the left, there's a great deal of sympathy being generated for those public workers who are losing their jobs. There's a great deal of concern about the policy, the programs that come out of USAID that apparently save the lives of children with cancer and AIDS and things like that. These research programs and medical programs that USAID funded. And Secret Asian Dan, longtime gadfly to the channel, asked me to say to justify the implication that the Gore cuts are of the same type as the DOGE cuts. And I would say that, actually I was repeating what Andrew Coburn was arguing in his piece, that there was a similarity, and that the similarity would just be that they were both justified on the basis of trying to make the government more efficient and to reduce the deficit. As to the particular cuts, it's impossible for me to say because I can't even say with any certainty what cuts are being made now. Exactly.
And this is to do with the speed. The timeline of you have to do this before you have a federal budget that you pass that includes a tax cut. And you have to create the relevant kinds of narratives surrounding that so that you can go into the midterm and do sufficiently well. This compels a particular speed to all of this. And so if you want to derail it, part of how you would derail it is to say, slow it down, look at each thing. talk about each thing, have a whole public debate about each one. If you do that, you won't be able to do anything like the pace that they have to do to accomplish the goal of produce a sufficient environment in which they can do the tax cut without losing so much public support that they then go on to get walloped in the midterm. They have to do this very, very quickly to accomplish that strategy. And that's what I think is getting missed. There are certain constraints that the political process imposes in terms of time, and then that causes decisions to be made in ways that aren't necessarily optimal on the basis of other goals, objectives, values that people have.
Right. But I do think it's worthwhile to step back, as Harper's piece tried to do, and just ask, what are the limits here that have been set up through neoliberalism, when it comes to at least the stated aims of DOGE or the tax cuts. I mean, let me ask you this, like, what is the purpose of the tax cuts? Why do the Republicans want yet another round of deep tax cuts? I mean, Clinton also cut capital gains taxes, and it seems to me, and Obama made the Bush tax cuts permanent. How is it that we keep needing more and deeper tax cuts?
Well, as you decouple from China, you want to get more of the business here as opposed to other places. You want a certain amount of it to go to the friends, but you also want to try to bring some of it back here, especially the stuff that's relevant for defense. So to do that, they have to create an attractive business environment. And so as they're saying to the business community, we don't want you doing so much of this stuff in China. We want you doing more of this stuff back here. They go, well, make it a good business decision for us to come back there. Make it something that is worth doing for us. Otherwise, why shouldn't we consider taking this stuff to India or Vietnam? You can make the business environment shaky in China, sure, and we may have to go somewhere else, but why should we come back to the United States specifically? And so there's an attempt to make the American business environment friendlier, not for the purposes of preventing these friendly states in other parts of the world from getting their fair share of the jobs, but to try to get at least, a significant portion of that activity back into the United States, especially the stuff that's relevant for defense. And this is also why they want to build the kinds of stuff that the people in the tech sector want to see. So if people in the tech sector want data centers all over the country, then they want to try to incentivize and subsidize the building of all of that.
Will the creation of those data centers in conjunction with the towers create more jobs and help combat the threat of unemployment?
They don't take that many jobs to run. Ultimately, those data centers, you might get something up front in terms of the building of them, but they don't require enormously large workforces to operate. I don't think that it's going to generate the kinds of things that they say, but also, what are your options in terms of how do you generate growth? What sectors seem to be promising or seem to be capable of delivering any kind of growth of whatever type? They are going to place their bets on the sectors that seem to have some potential.
Eli says tax cuts are a polite way of saying public subsidy for private capital, which, from my point of view, is Eli channeling Noam Chomsky circa 1995, which doesn't make it untrue. But neoliberalism has always been a way of propping up private capital through the state. So this is, someone else says,
there's a conceptual question here. Can we distinguish between a quango and something that is genuinely outside of the state? When the state cuts taxes, does this just result in the proliferation of quangos, or does it permit some genuine kind of non-state activity to take place? And this is a deep question, and it has a lot to do with, what are the current needs in society, and is the state doing things that have to be done in some sense? And if they have to be done, then if a private entity is doing them, does that make any kind of fundamental difference to what can happen with it? Or does it just become a quasi non-governmental way of doing the same thing that you were previously doing?
Yeah. Well, answer your own question there, Ben. What do you think?
I think it depends a lot on the sector. So if you're in a situation where the company, all of what it does is still state contracts, and therefore everything that it does is based on what the customer, the state, wants, then a company like that is really not fully a non-state actor. But
Right.
if you have a situation where you're no longer getting public money and your customer base isn't the state, then you have some genuinely different kind of operation going on. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that operation is better or freer or in any sense preferable. There's an actual question that I think has to be asked about whether the market or the state, which one is the less bad way of dealing with a particular problem in capitalism. Mm-hmm. There is sometimes, I think, a tendency to fetishize, and often different parts of the left will fetishize different sides of it and say the market necessarily is a freer way of dealing with the problem, or the state is necessarily a freer way. And this has a lot to do with how people feel about democracy versus how they feel about pricing, and which of these processes of bringing together inputs from large numbers of people and then having a kind of decision come out of those inputs, they think of as more expressive of human freedom. But really, in both cases, it's an impersonal system operating on the basis of a logic that we don't directly control, imposing things upon us in an alienated way. So I don't think that there's one or the other that's obviously the good one.
Well, I mean, the question of automation is in the background here in both the private and the public sector, right? I mean, when I think about the public sector in terms of socialism, I think about how easy would it be to organize public sector workers for socialism? And there are some legal and institutional restraints there in the public sector that have not been overcome in the past, and which I think would be very difficult to overcome. And so, but at the same time, if the private sector is monopolizing, concentrating, and doesn't require as many workers, because of automation and the emphasis on data centers over other forms of productive work,
and immigration, and the possibility of sucking in foreign populations, if you are dealing with a sector where you have a lot of resistance from your local population to the particular working conditions that you want to impose.
Right. But I mean, I think that the problem of immigration, if we were organizing workers for socialism, the immigrant labor could be incorporated into that effort. I don't think that there are limits on the ability of immigrants to organize politically, but they're not. But they're mostly a matter of the precarity of those immigrant workers, rather than
also being accustomed to a labor environment that is very bad in a state like India, and then getting moved to the United States, where you might be in an environment that is, for us, very bad, but for you seems to be a significant improvement over what you could get in India. I think that is also one of the reasons why immigrants tend to be difficult to organize. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And often people who are coming to the United States are coming because they want to be in the United States. They're excited about being in the United States. They don't tend to want to take up the kinds of critiques that left-wingers tend to make of the United States. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe there's a different way in which the left could talk that would be more tractable, or different positions the left could take that would be more amenable. But I think generally this has been one of the major problems. The immigrant population doesn't tend to think in the way the left presumes that it should or must. And you see this very clearly in the inability of the left to predict the behavior of Hispanic voters. Mm-hmm. The attempt to racialize them, the attempt to treat them as, very narrowly workers. These things haven't really worked in terms of mobilizing Hispanic Americans to vote for particular parties or to support particular issues. And so most of the time, the left is just running around in a kind of headless chicken way when dealing with that part of the population.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to Ezra Klein. Zoe says that, that this was an attractive video to click on so we could kick Ezra Klein a bit. And let's not leave Ezra completely unscathed, or, I feel like Ezra hasn't taken enough lumps yet. But in an effort to go after Ezra Klein, I'm going to actually defend him, which is to ask you this question. If we met, because one of the planks of the abundance agenda is to bring in more immigrant labor. And if we were to imagine that this immigrant labor was living in a Baudelarian high-rise, in one of these giant towers with the pods, maybe a mix of J.G. Ballard's high-rise and the proposal in the movie Holy Mountain, where every worker gets their own little coffin-shaped pod to live in that is stacked up on each other. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. It's bizarre, but that's a scene that is worth revisiting. If we were to imagine that these immigrant workers were living in pods in these giant towers, would that actually make it easier for organizers to find grievances that would be tractable amongst immigrant workers? And also, given that they would be all living together in not a company town, but a company tower, would it be easier to organize them because they would have a collectivity to begin with already?
Well, maybe to a point. The thing is, that's mainly going to be service workers in big cities. It's not going to be where they're going to put the factories. If they build the factories, It's going to be outside of those places.
Right. So no is the answer. They're not likely to be filled with immigrant workers.
You might get a certain part of the way there. I'm sure you can do some stuff that would marginally improve the conditions for service workers. There are things that can be done to marginally improve pay and conditions for service workers. And I'm not opposed to those things. But does that lead into socialism plausibly? Is a separate question from, is there some stuff you can do that makes things a little bit better? And I don't begrudge or tell anybody not to do things that make things a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, I don't either, but it is worthwhile to keep in mind that the aim for socialists should be to develop a movement for, and eventually a party for, socialism. And so, but it does seem like the conversation we had earlier about the service workers being kicked around by towns and cities because they were thought to be dysfunctional, or their families.
Yeah, right now what you do is you make them transit in. So you have your nice coffee shops and your nice craft breweries in Valparaiso, and then you have people drive in from Portage or Michigan City or LaPorte or Lake Station. They drive in from the neighboring towns, and then they park, and they've built all of this parking infrastructure because the town is still, Valpo is still small enough that they can build enough parking infrastructure, and the roads are still good enough, and the population is not so dense that you can have these people drive in from towns that are a good 15 to 20 minutes away with farmland still between Valparaiso and these other towns. Drive them in, park them. Now, what happens when you get to a density where you can't do that? At a certain point, you have to either build public transit or you have to build a tower. And so then the debate becomes transit versus tower. And the way that neoliberalism goes, the way that this process is unfolding, you don't have enough capacity to build the public transit. It's easier to build the tower. That's the path of least resistance.
The path of least resistance is probably going to be, why not both? Meaning, how about neither? What you'll end up with is maybe one or two attempts at these towers, which will either remain empty or
And you'll have to do
return.
one of them. You'll have to do one of them because at a certain point, it will become too expensive for people to come in from neighboring towns because the parking won't be available. The parking will become too expensive. It will become too hard for them to park. You do get to a point as the population increases, if you want to still be able to have affordable coffee and affordable beer in the town, you are going to have to at some point do something to make it easier for these people to be in the town. And this is how, no matter how hard they try to preserve the character of the town, they eventually do have to build the tower. And once they do that, then they get a bunch of these kids in the schools that they don't want. And this is the cyclical character of it. Eventually, you do get to a point where you have to let these people move into the town. And once that happens, now you are a city just like every other city.
Yeah, but if you're New York City or San Francisco, there's another option, which is to decline. Have the this city
you
become unlivable. Have the people who were living in your city move, and wait for to get some federal bailout money to keep the city alive. And then, wait for the situation to change. And then in 10, 20 years, 30 years, it will all come back around again and people move back into the city. And if the
let the jobs just get moved to Texas. Just let the Texan cities and Atlanta, let these places get the jobs. That can happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what Klein is attempting to stop. But it's not actually necessarily in the interests of the entire country for these cities to be saved by these towers, which, by the way, wouldn't necessarily do the job.
Yes, but the argument is not made to the whole country. It's made to Californians because the zoning rules, the land use rules, those are Californian rules. A lot of those are Democrats in California, Democrats in New York. It's their rules. So the critique is of the Democratic Party and how it runs its states. But it's an imminent critique because they are Democrats, of course, and they want the Democrats to win. They just want the Democrats to follow different policies with regard to land use and zoning in those states.
I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to do something. We're almost at the end of this stream. We'll be running a Zoom call for patrons. People can join in a conversation about socialism, Ezra Klein, Harper's, or anything else they want to bring to the table. Let's see if I can. I'm just going to, at random, pick a couple more factoids from the Harper's Index and see what we think of them before we go. Let's see. Chance that an American, this is perfect for me. Chance that an American believes they have undiagnosed ADHD. It's 1 in 4. Chance that they do have ADHD, 1 in 17. Portion of Americans who say that keeping their house clean is harder than working a full-time job, 1 in 4. Percentage of events at nightclubs in New York City that went past 3 a.m. in 2014. You want to take a guess?
Past 3 a.m. in 2014?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, maybe.
I'll tell you,
60%.
70%. And
okay.
How many do so today?
20.
Right. And finally, this is one I don't.
I'm dead on right. Did I get that right?
No, I'm sorry. It's 53%. I'm sorry. I got distracted by my ADHD.
Okay.
53%.
And then it's finally, not as bad as I thought it was.
No. The final one here is the average amount of time in nanoseconds by which each day on Earth is longer than the last.
Oh, I have no idea.
47 nanoseconds. But I think that what this is, that last factoid is like basically, oh, woe is me, life is too long, and things just keep stretching in the same way on forever and ever without the change that's needed. Something like that. I think that's the point of that last, but only by 47 nanoseconds. It's not extending quickly, or in great numbers. All right, let's wrap it up here. We're just at the hour. Sorry about my ADHD there at the end, but I enjoyed the conversation.
Is that undiagnosed?
It is undiagnosed ADHD. And we'll see you over in the parrot room.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people